Beyond Sports.
Welcome to Beyond Sports with Paul and Jeremy. This is Jeremy here. I'm going to be doing this show solo today in the first of what I call solo sessions. Paul and I will try to do these when we don't have full conversations between ourselves. The Last Dance documentary has provided weeks worth of content on sports outlets. And I think some of it might be a little manufactured, such as the debate about how Jordan would have fared in today's NBA if he would have averaged 40 or not. Like an NBA team would let that happen to him, right? But there is also talk about how good the Bulls would have been in today's NBA, or if they would have beaten some of the best teams in the modern NBA, such as the 73-9 Warriors in a 7-game series. There's also the GOAT debate, which to me is a little overdone, but this has been the bread and butter of many of the national sports outlets. It's usually about Michael Jordan and whether he is the best player compared to whoever is the best player of the day. Right now it's LeBron, but of course there are many other debates in other sports. And for me, I'm not a big fan of the GOAT debate. I mean, they can be fun, but they don't provide enough context, in my opinion, to appreciate a player. So today I want to talk about those debates and why they aren't exactly well done in most cases. To start, we all know what the term GOAT means. It stands for greatest of all time, of course. And in doing some of my research for this podcast, I learned that the term is actually now in the dictionary, meaning it's been used so much over the recent years that the people who edit dictionaries have decided that it's officially a distinct word, and they give in to its existence. So now you can look up the word GOAT, and one of the definitions being, of course, the acronym greatest of all time. It's the same way that Bootylicious made it into the dictionary. The term GOAT, or greatest of all time, I should say, originates with Muhammad Ali, who in the early 90s, his wife used it as a company name for all of his intellectual property. They called it GOAT Inc., as in it was just an abbreviation at that point and not an acronym. But the acronym is supposedly traced back to LL Cool J, who in 2000 released his album called GOAT, the title track being I'm the GOAT, greatest of all time. So that's when we really hear it being used as an acronym. And LL Cool J, he'd been bad since Rock the Bells. So I guess he had a good claim to being called the GOAT of rap. Muhammad Ali himself, of course, one of the best boxers ever. We all know that, and there won't be any dispute about that. So yeah, he also had a claim to being called the GOAT in his field. But the debate is, to me, where the issue really goes off the rails, and not necessarily in terms of having the conversation at all, but I don't think we have the conversation in the right way. And maybe it's not that it should be a debate and someone should think that they're the winner. Maybe it should be a casual, friendly debate where we all learn a little bit from each other. It seems to me all we can do is argue when it comes to who is the GOAT of any field. And I doubt we'll come to any real consensus because to me, there is no one GOAT of any sport. And now I'll go a little bit into different sports and kind of how that argument works and why, to me, it's not a great argument to have. So when we say GOAT, and I'm using this word so much now it's starting to sound funny to me, but when we say that term, each person's probably thinking about a different set of criteria. And that to me is where kind of the disconnect starts. So let's look at the NBA. Commonly today, Michael Jordan would be called the GOAT because of all of his achievements. And I'll read some of these out. And of course, first and foremost is what people love to use to laud Michael Jordan, and that being his 6 NBA championships and 6 NBA Finals MVPs while going 6-0 in the NBA Finals. Of course, perfect record, MVP every single time. That's the stuff of legend, and of course, that's what makes him the greatest of all time, right? 5-time NBA MVP, and sometimes there were some MVPs that people thought he should have won, like in 1993 over Charles Barkley, 1997 over Karl Malone. Jordan is a 14-time All-Star, 3-time All-Star Game MVP, 9-time All-Defensive First Team, 1988 NBA Defensive Player of the Year. He has the highest points per game average in the NBA history at 30.12 points per game, which is slightly above Wilt Chamberlain's 30.07 points per game. He came right out the gate, averaging 28 as a rookie, age 21 to 22, and at the end of his career as a 39 or 40-year-old, he averaged 20 points. So in his entire career, he never averaged less than 20 points a game. He was also fiercely competitive, one of the best athletes anyone had ever seen. Also, in my opinion, he's subject of one of the most effective media campaigns in modern history. Everybody wanted to be like Mike. Everybody was wondering if it was the shoes. I mean, if you weren't drinking Gatorade when you were playing sports, what were you doing? Water was kind of secondary at that point. Like, don't drink water, drink Gatorade. Everybody wanted to drive with the tongue out. For people between 30 and 40 like me, if you grew up as a sports fan, you were immersed in everything Jordan. So it's not hard to understand why he is considered to be the greatest of them all, the GOAT. But why are the media so quick to point out that he's the greatest? And what are their criteria for claiming him as the greatest? Of course, to me, I go back to the undefeated finals record. So for those who are fans of perfection, it's the 6-0 finals record that is their trump card. Anytime you want to quote anyone else as being close, you got to go back to, did they lose in the finals? Did they ever go to a game 7? And that's their trump card. And of course, Jordan being the greatest because he won all those finals without losing. Well, okay, he didn't lose, but he only won 6 finals and the greatest ever. Why not Bill Russell? He was the NBA's ultimate winner. He had 11 championships in 13 seasons, including 2 as a player coach in 1968 and 1969. That made him the first black coach to win a championship in North American history. You want to talk about trailblazers, people that really pushed the boundaries and gave hope for people that were before them. He said that he brought his grandfather into the locker room after he won a championship, and the grandfather just cried because he saw that his grandson was leading a locker room full of people of all races, not just black people, but white people too. And to me, that speaks volumes as to his place in sports and history overall in America. Now, of course, I could talk more about the conditions that black athletes had to play with racism in the 1950s and 60s, and it was horrible because they were treated as less than everywhere except for on the court. And of course, there were no commercials that said "Be like Bill" to help build his legacy. All he did was win. If you look up who has the most championships, of course, aside from Bill Russell, you'll get 9 other individuals who won more than Jordan. 8 of them played for the Celtics dynasty of the 50s and 60s, and the other is Robert Horry, who overlapped with Jordan for about 10 seasons in the middle of Jordan's career. So I know most people would say Horry never led a team, so that's why they would consider him to be out, but Horry also never lost in the finals. And I know a lot of people would probably say, well, he's been the beneficiary of a lot of good teams that he just happened to be a role player on. But there's a reason they called him Big Shot Bob. The guy made smart plays. The guy took a lot of charges on defense. He was where he needed to be, and he helped his team win. He was never just a part of a team. He helped that team win. But you'll never hear anybody giving him credit, of course, because he didn't have any killer instinct. He didn't lead any teams. The Celtics, why would anyone from the Celtics be considered the greatest? They only played in an 8-team league back in the late 50s and in the 60s. But of course, in 1961-62, the league did expand by 1 team, and the league kept adding teams until in Russell's last year as a player coach, there were 14 teams in the league. Now the competition gets a little bit stiffer maybe, but in any case, there are more teams, so now you can't just say he dominated a small league because the league got bigger and they still won. Anyway, when a person is asked to win, are they asked to beat every team that's ever existed? No, they're asked to beat who was in front of them at the time. And if you win the championship 11 times in 13 seasons, you've beaten everyone you've been asked to beat consistently, almost every single time. And by my math, I'd much rather have 11 championships out of 13 seasons than 6 out of 14 seasons or 6 out of 16 seasons. And for me, the point of competition is winning, like I said. So because the game wasn't as lucrative back then in the 60s, 100,000, 100K was around the highest that a player had received in 1965. That translates to about 800,000 today. The glory to me, because most players weren't making the amounts of money that players today are making. It wasn't in the money, it was in the winning. And Russell won, so did Sam Jones, Tommy Heinsohn, Casey Jones, and others who won more than Jordan. So what if the record isn't perfect? Jordan could have gotten more if he'd won all of them that he had a chance to win. If he'd have made the finals as many times as the Celtics, then I'm sure Jordan, with his undefeated finals record and his unwillingness to lose, would have won every single one, and maybe he would have had 13 or 14 championships. And like I said before, Russell himself was a trailblazer, which to me adds a lot to a person's legacy. And now let's talk about finals appearances just in general. Well, what if you just want chances to win? Well, how about a person like LeBron James? 9 finals appearances. He might have a losing record in those finals appearances, but he got there every time. I know people are saying that, oh, the East is weak in his time in the NBA, and it was. And he had to manufacture teams to get to the championships. Yes, he did. But the fact is, within the context of the game and within the rules of the game, he was able to get there 9 times. 3-6 in those 9 appearances. But again, if he'd had that winning percentage, sure, he could be 9-0 too. How about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? 6 championships in 10 appearances. Not too bad, 10 times getting there. Magic Johnson, who won 5 in 9 appearances. Jerry West, who went there 9 times as well. Won once, but he got there 9 times. A lot of people are able to get to that championship level. Whether or not they win every single time, they're still getting there. And getting there means something. It means you're really good and your team is really good and they've benefited from your play. How about Scottie Pippen? Even Scottie Pippen reached the finals as many times as Jordan himself, of course. Because Jordan said it, there is no Jordan without Pippen. So do finals appearances matter only for Jordan? Do wins matter only for Jordan when there is a teammate of his has the exact same record, had the exact same teammates the whole time because they were never apart during that run? And of course, you have a guy like Phil Jackson, a coach. Do we attribute Phil Jackson's greatness to the reason why that the Bulls won, or is it just Michael Jordan? So to me, you can't have that same debate without talking about the full reasons why those teams were able to get there, those teams won. Do we want to include winning at all levels when we talk about who the greatest ever is? How about NCAA championships? We could go back to high school, but let's just stay with the NCAA championship. Bill Russell again, Kareem, Magic, all have NCAA championships. Russell has 2 back-to-back. Kareem has 3. And even those 2 showed more dominance at the college level in a sense than Jordan, based on winning. How about if we use MVPs as a way to measure who the best is in a certain sport? Well, okay, Jordan. Jordan has 5 regular season MVPs. And that's usually, the MVP is usually the benchmark for a great season. If a guy wins the MVP, best player in the league that year. Either that or he's the best player on the best team. But usually that's the benchmark for a great season. And if you have 5 like Jordan has, you're in rare company. Well, again, let's go back to Kareem. Kareem has 6. And he won his first MVP in his second year. So he's been winning and leading his team to great records since his second year. Now, Jordan averaged 28 as a rookie, like I said. So he had a great rookie year too, but let's not discount a lot of other great rookies, a lot of other great players who've been good since day one. There are other players with plus or minus 1 MVP compared to Jordan, including LeBron and Wilt, both who have 4, Bill Russell, who has 5 just like Jordan has. And I know the MVP is highly influenced by the media. In the same way, Jordan could have won more, LeBron could have won more too. I know LeBron's had a few years where they thought that they were just giving the MVP to other people just so it seemed more fair. But in any case, if Jordan could have won more, LeBron could have won more. Then we could use that to bolster our argument for someone else. We could use that to bolster our argument for Kareem right now. And how about in MVP history, where Steph Curry was the first and only unanimous MVP in NBA history? Now that's got to count for something. So if we're going to use MVPs, we could talk about the different types of MVP, as in the unanimous versus the non-unanimous MVP. We talk about how many. That's another way to refute that argument of who is the best. And how about points? We can talk about points and to determine who's the best. Well, Jordan has the highest average points per game in NBA history, right? As I said, 30.12 points. And his scoring from day one to the end of his career is legendary in that he never averaged less than 20. But he's only slightly above Wilt's 30.07 points per game scoring average. And Wilt pretty much has every NBA scoring record. You go look up the record books, Wilt's name is all over him. And some of those records he has will not be touched. He has the single game scoring record with 100. He's got the most points in a half with 59. The most points per game in a season with 50.4. The most 70-point games with 5. The most career 60-point games with 32. To put that in context, the second place person on that list is Kobe Bryant. He has 6 60-point games compared to 32. Wilt has the most 50-point games in a career with 118. Jordan is second on that list with 31. And to me, looking at 50 points in a game and knowing that Wilt did it 118 times, you hear a person put up 50, that's a huge deal. Wilt did it regularly. Wilt also had the most points per game as a rookie with 37.6. And when he retired, he was the all-time leader in points scored. And that, of course, was without a three-point line, let alone his attempting a three-pointer, which we know he probably wouldn't have done anyway. So there's something between 60 and 70 individual records that Wilt has. He led the NBA in assists also one year. So to me, Wilt is more of a myth than a real person at times, because the things he did on a basketball court, I don't think will be matched. I don't think they can be matched by anyone. So then if we're going to talk about scoring records and use that, which we could do, of course, let's talk about Kareem too, because Kareem needs to be mentioned because he's the all-time points leader, and possibly he could be passed at some point, but he is currently the all-time points leader. And of course, he played for 20 seasons, and he scored 20 points per game until his last few seasons, and 10 points per game in his last season. But the fact is, he still was the most effective point scorer in NBA history, which of course you add that to the list of things that a GOAT should have, right? And then you can start to really refute those other arguments as to who's the best. I think it's kind of funny. My dad used to tell me a story saying that the Lakers would play defense, and then when they went down on offense, they'd run back, and they'd have to wait for Kareem to just run up the court so he can get set up in the lane, and they can throw him the ball, and he could do his skyhook. Of course, this was at the end of his career, but I always think that's a funny. I never saw it, but I think that's a funny image. Looking at points, I'm sure LeBron one day is going to be the all-time points leader because of his durability, of course, and the way he can just score points in the paint at will. And even in his 17th season now, he doesn't seem to be slowing down that much. So I think one day he'll be the all-time points leader. And is that going to change the argument? Probably, because it has to when you have to factor in these certain criteria. And of course, I don't know if accumulation of points is going to be a great measure of greatness, because you do have to be available in order to score these points. But is accumulation the same thing as peak performance? If you've never been the all-time points leader in a given season, then do your total points not count as much? And that's the problem I have with these sorts of arguments. And of course, what other criteria can we use to determine who is the NBA GOAT? Defensive stats, really, in my opinion, are only used to bolster other arguments. So people use Jordan's all-defensive teams and Defensive Player of the Year to knock down anyone that isn't seen as a great defender. Say LeBron, for example, who does have 6 NBA first teams, but most people at this point in his career especially wouldn't say he's a great defender. Or Kobe, who has the same number of all defensive first teams as Jordan. He doesn't have a Defensive Player of the Year, and he only has the one MVP, of course, so they can use that as a way to knock down Kobe when compared to Jordan. So overall, after saying all these numbers, who's the NBA GOAT? And for me, I don't know, and that's okay, in my opinion, because I'd much rather be taught something. And I don't want to argue the point just because it's fun to argue. I'd rather just hear what you have to say and learn from you. And that's what it's about. We can share our opinions and share our memories of our favorite players and use that as a way to really bond and learn from each other in sports. Okay, so let's jump from the NBA to the NFL. Now, I think NFL stats are a little bit harder to kind of use to make your argument, and the NFL stats aren't really used as much as winning. So one person, let's say in the NFL, of course, can't be as dominant as one person can be in the NBA. That's because it's such a team sport, and one person's performance is so dependent on the rest of his team doing their jobs in order for him to actually do his own job. So who's the GOAT in the NFL? Of course, it's going to be Tom Brady. That's what everyone says, right? And why are they saying Tom Brady? Well, he's won the most Super Bowls as a starting quarterback. If I use the same argument in the NFL, I would be calling Bill Russell the GOAT, right? There would be no doubt, no dispute as to who the GOAT would be in the NBA if I use this same argument, because winning trumps everything. And in the NFL, winning percentage isn't as important as winning. And what I mean by that is Brady has reached 9 Super Bowls and won 6 of those Super Bowls with 4 Super Bowl MVPs. So he is 6-3 in Super Bowls. Now, as soon as he won his 5th, people declared him the GOAT, the greatest of all time in the NFL because of his sheer number of Super Bowls. Well, he's won the most, but he lost. So how can he be the best ever? How can he be the greatest ever? Because I'm pretty sure there are quarterbacks that haven't lost, right? And we know this. But how can a quarterback win a Super Bowl by himself anyway? How can that 6-3 record mean that he's better than any other quarterback that ever played just because he happened to have those wins behind his name? So to me and to a lot of other people, football is the ultimate team sport, where a football player and coach will also tell you that. And much more so than in basketball, you need your teammates there to help you be successful. Basketball, one player can carry a team to a championship series. Maybe not to the championship, but at least to the series. One player, of course, can make the difference in a team's performance, and that reminds me and makes me think of Randy Moss in the 18-1 Patriots year. He helped make that difference and turn that team into the juggernaut that it was on offense. But one player cannot will his team to a win like a player can in the NBA. And of course, position matters in the NFL more than the NBA. Because in the NBA, any player can be good from any position, whereas in the NFL, a quarterback can't be compared to a running back. And in some people's eyes, that quarterback might not be a real football player compared to that running back who's getting hit every single time he touches the ball. And then there are other positions in the NFL, in football, like an offensive lineman whose contributions can't really be appreciated in terms of winning records and championships in the same way that a quarterbacks can. Now, we all know that there are all pros that are selected as linemen. There are Hall of Famers that are linemen. But does any of those linemen get credited with the wins from his team? Do any of those linemen get credited with a Super Bowl win? And do they have a win-loss record? No, it's put on the quarterback. And so because of that, the quarterback gets the glory and gets that status that no other position gets in today's NFL at the very least. So let's look at Brady. So in his first 3 Super Bowls, the team was focused on its defense. He wasn't asked to carry the offense. He was just asked to not mess up, to make some timely plays, which he did. To his credit, he made the plays that mattered. And those games were either won by a field goal or the difference was a field goal. So clearly the special teams and the field goal kicker were important to those victories. Now, Brady didn't perform poorly, but he wasn't the reason why his teams won. Of course, afterward, the team focused its offense on what he could do. And so the next 6 Super Bowls were teams that catered to his skill set more so. And it could be argued that he is 3-3 as the centerpiece of a Super Bowl team. Whereas if we look again, like I said, other quarterbacks who have been undefeated in Super Bowls, first one comes to mind, of course, is the person that used to be considered the GOAT in the NFL, also a quarterback, Joe Montana. And Joe Montana is 4-0 in Super Bowls with 3 Super Bowl MVPs. To me, this parallels the MJ argument for the NBA in that an undefeated record is better than more wins that have losses on their records. But of course, no one anymore says that Joe Montana is better just because of the number. To me, neither of these players is who they are without their systems, because Brady played for the coach that most consider the GOAT NFL coach. And it's hard to separate the player from the coach and who's more important in that contribution to winning. I don't know who's more important, and I don't think we'll ever know. We get a chance next year to see Tom Brady without Bill Belichick coaching. We get to see Bill Belichick with a new quarterback. So we'll see how that looks when next year's NFL season starts. But Montana himself also was a perfect fit in the West Coast system. And of course, you've seen many Walsh disciples use the West Coast to great success. In that sense, it's hard to separate the player from the scheme. So, okay, we looked at Super Bowls and we could make an argument there, but what about individual records? Regular season MVPs might help even the playing field for the NFL GOAT. Now, that would go to Peyton Manning. And in my opinion, Peyton Manning is like the LeBron of the NFL in that he was the team system. So when a team did well, he got the honor of MVP. And to me, that might be the closest that we have for an NFL player to being an NBA player in his responsibility for a team's success. That's about the closest that I can find. And the number of MVP awards he won shows that, in my opinion. So if we want to just talk about, well, now my criteria is based on MVPs, well, then let's look at Peyton Manning as the NFL GOAT. Brady has 3 MVPs. Favre has 3. And to me, it's more of a quarterback award. So anytime we're using MVPs, we're still only going to bring up quarterbacks. So maybe it's not the best measure for the GOAT argument. However, Jim Brown is the only running back to receive multiple MVP awards, even though a few of those awards are considered disputed. But that is one non-quarterback player that then comes into play when we're talking about MVPs, and rightfully so. So MVPs leads us to quarterbacks usually, but it gives us different quarterbacks. What about stats? To me, this is kind of where I struggle because the NFL, to me, is heavily dependent on your position. So we can look at each individual skill position based on stats. Let's think about running backs, okay? Emmitt Smith. Let's look at Emmitt Smith because he's the top running back in terms of rushing yards with 18,355 rushing yards. The second place rusher is Walter Payton with about 1,600 yards less than Emmitt Smith. And of course, 1,600 yards would be a really good season in today's NFL. And I mean, it would be a really good season in any era, but it's almost impossible. So if Walter Payton were to be able to come back and play another season, let's say, could he still catch up to Emmitt Smith's numbers? And the answer is today, probably not. So I think that record is fairly out of reach. I think Frank Gore is close, but Frank Gore is probably still another few seasons away. So I don't think that record is in danger of being touched. So looking at running backs, Emmitt Smith by far is the best running back. So we can look at that. Okay, so what about wide receivers? Let's look at wide receivers in terms of receiving yards. So Jerry Rice is the top wide receiver in terms of yards with 22,895. He leads second place Larry Fitzgerald by 5,800 yards, which is probably more than 5 seasons. So Larry Fitzgerald is still active, but he's not that active. And we all know Larry Fitzgerald is getting toward the end of his career. If he has 3 more seasons, that's probably going to be good for him if that's even within him. So that one is even more out of reach. So Jerry Rice is even more above his peers than Emmitt Smith is. Now let's look at quarterbacks. Drew Brees is the all-time passing yards leader with 77,416 passing yards. Second place is Tom Brady, who's only 3,000 yards behind, which is not even a full season. So if Drew Brees were to get hurt and sit out for 12 weeks, Tom Brady could conceivably pass him if he played every single game. So looking at those skill positions, just based on accumulation of yards, of course, we can see that Jerry Rice is more of an outlier relative to his peers than anyone else. Though Emmitt Smith's numbers might also be hard to reach because of the emphasis of the run game. But as it stands, Jerry Rice is much more of an outlier. Now, let's look at a per game basis, and we get some different names. So Jim Brown leads the NFL in rushing yards per game with 104 yards per game. Barry Sanders is second with 99.8. So Barry Sanders is right at 100 yards per game, but he's 4 yards per game behind Jim Brown. Julio Jones leads the NFL in receiving yards per game with 96.2. And Michael Thomas and Odell Beckham are second and third on the list, which just shows the impact of the modern passing game on receiving numbers. So those guys, they can probably be passed because they're active right now, which means that this current emphasis on the passing game can probably lead to other very talented receivers passing them in the future. Jerry Rice is actually 11th in receiving yards per game, so that's kind of a testament to his durability. And I think in the NBA, durability is a good thing, but it's not everything. I think durability in the NFL is actually even more important. But that's my spin. And again, that's what makes these arguments so hard because I have a different set of criteria that I find important than you probably do. But to me, durability in the NFL speaks a lot to a player because it's hard to stay healthy in a violent sport. Looking at passing yards per game, Drew Brees is first in passing yards per game with 281. Matthew Stafford is second with 275. Now, we can see, of course, that these are two modern quarterbacks, but Drew Brees is leading quarterbacks in all statistical categories that I've seen in terms of passing yards and touchdowns. So he is clearly great at passing the football and getting it to his receivers where they can actually make the play and catch it. But does that tell us anything about his greatness, or does that tell us more about his system? And how about touchdowns? There isn't a great comparison in terms of touchdowns because if you look at the all-time touchdown list, they're going to be skill players. It's not going to be quarterbacks, right? Because a touchdown pass is seen differently than a touchdown reception or a rushing touchdown. But Jerry Rice leads the NFL in touchdowns with 208. Emmitt Smith is second with 175. So again, that's 33 touchdowns different between two players that are both retired. And so let's say Emmitt Smith came back to play again. That would take at least 2 seasons for him to catch up, at least 2. And who's getting 16 rushing touchdowns a season now? That's a really hard one to do. Again, that just shows how much of an outlier Jerry Rice was compared to anyone that played in terms of receiving yards and catching the football in general. Larry Fitzgerald is actually the highest active player in touchdowns with 120. So to me, that record is out of reach. Brees also leads quarterbacks in touchdown passes with 546 over Brady, who has 541. And again, if health became a concern and Brady was healthy and Brees was injured, they could probably switch places. So that's not really that much difference. So really, there's not much in terms of separation there. So looking at the numbers for the NFL, it's hard to make a clear case for anyone because really there aren't any common stats for quarterbacks and other skill positions. But Jerry Rice, to me, stands out so far above his peers that it's not really that close. And of course, before that, there was Jim Brown, who decided that football wasn't the most important thing in his life, and he retired before 30 as the league's record holder for both single season rushing yards at 1,863 and career rushing yards at 12,312. And then he was also the league's all-time leader in rushing touchdowns and total touchdowns and all-purpose yards. So just records on records that he had when he retired before age 30. And he was the first player to reach 100 rushing touchdowns. To me, football isn't just about passing the balls. If you ask me who the best football player is or the greatest ever, I'm not going to say it's a quarterback. I'm really not. I'm not a person who has extensive history playing football. I never played. But just the idea of what it takes to play football, and you see what these guys put themselves through. A person that's on that field taking those hits, a person that's given the ball and told to run through the line and not to get tackled and to just get beaten to a pulp. That to me is what makes a real football player because it's hard. It is the hardest thing to do. And these running backs now whose career is on average 3 years, if you can make it 15 years in that position, you've done something. So I think a person that dominates their peers and can just make plays happen in the open field, make people look bad like amateurs, I think that's a great football player. So that's, to me, if I look at Jim Brown and I see highlights, I think, wow, that guy did something nobody else is doing. And you can't tell me whoever is throwing the ball is better than that guy. To me, that argument, like I said, doesn't begin and end with a quarterback. And I'm sure that it needs to include a lot more than just quarterbacks. So who's the greatest of all time in the NFL? To me, I'll let you think about that. But I think you got to expand your horizons to a little more than just a quarterback based on Super Bowls, because there are a lot of people involved in those Super Bowl victories. And the last thing I want to talk about is a sport that I like to follow, and it's just something that interests me, is tennis, and specifically men's tennis, because the GOAT debate in men's tennis, to me, is funny because it features 3 people who are actually playing right now. And I don't think there's other sports where the best players in that sport all time are actually active at the same time. It's kind of hard to believe. So how is this GOAT debate argued in tennis? Well, it's based on major titles. And those majors are 128 player tournaments. They're best of 5 sets for the men. And so that makes them the hardest tournaments on tour. Most of the other tournaments are best of 3 sets, and they're smaller numbers of players, so you get a little less of a toll put on you as you go through the tournament. But the majors are the toughest task that the tennis players are asked to do in order to win a championship. The 3 players, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic, are the top 3 players in major tournament victories with 20, 19, and 17 respectively. And they're also the top 3 in major finals appearances. So to me, the numbers are small, but there's not really a difference. It's a razor thin difference between the 3. So Federer having 20, anyone arguing for him says he is the GOAT, end of story, because he has the most. And that's what we're doing in the NFL. Not necessarily what we're doing in the NBA, right? But that's what we're doing in the NFL. So we'll use that measurement for tennis. Federer's the GOAT. Well, those of you who argue for anyone else can try to chip away at his numbers by saying he won so many in a so-called weak era, where he won 11 Grand Slams from 2003 to 2007. And at the time, it's argued there were very few multiple Grand Slam winners and really great players. So there weren't a lot of people to stop him from winning. And that's almost as if he played in that eight team era of the NBA, right? So they somehow want to use it as a problem because he beat the people that he beat. But those are his competition. Those are people that he has to beat, and he won. So it shouldn't also be you can't win but also have won against weak competition. It just doesn't make any sense. He beat who he had to beat. But okay, that's fine. Let's look at another one of his competitors to the throne. So Rafael Nadal, for him, his supporters say that he's 19. He has 19, and having 19, he's 5 years younger. So it's simple in that as soon as Federer retires, Nadal will pass him, and probably at the next French Open because of his dominance at that tournament. So Federer fans will say that Nadal has won most of his majors at the French Open, which has been 12 out of his 19. So he's shown dominance at that, unlike anyone else at any other major tournament, but he's not shown versatility. But Nadal fans will say, okay, Federer guys, head to head, scoreboard, Nadal's won 24 out of their 40 matchups. So he's 24-16 against Federer. So how can Federer be the GOAT if he can't beat one of his own peers more often than not? So now we're going from majors to head-to-head record because the major record doesn't work right now for Nadal. So head-to-head is what we're going to use. I think this is an interesting study, though, because tennis is an individual sport, and individual sports always are affected by your mentality. You don't have teammates to help prop you up on the field. Now, of course, you have a coach, you have trainers and things like that, but once you're out performing, you're by yourself. And I think that there's probably a mental edge that Nadal has over Federer that is more nuanced than just a head-to-head record. So it probably won't be counted, but with a better head-to-head record and the same number of majors, basically, why isn't Nadal considered the GOAT then? Why wouldn't he just be the GOAT? Well, there's also the third challenger to the throne, Novak Djokovic, and he has an interesting position in this group. He's the youngest of the three by about a year to Nadal, and he's had slightly less time to accumulate the majors. But it's thought that, of course, with Nadal aging what seems like more rapidly because of the way he pushes his body, maybe then Djokovic will have more time after he and Federer retire. Currently, though, he's at 17, whereas at the same age, Nadal was slightly ahead. So you have to think that if he's two behind Nadal, that means he has to have a really good season to catch up to Nadal. He needs to get all of those in one season because he's not going to be able to play until he's 40. Like most of these guys, I don't think can play till they're 40. Federer is such a graceful athlete. He's had injuries, but he's managed to stay healthier longer. He doesn't play long, grueling points like Djokovic and Nadal do. So the idea is that those two guys have a little more time, but I don't think they have as much time as Federer did in terms of their total career span. But I see this as being like Brady and Breeze in terms of Djokovic and Nadal, just slightly farther apart because they're right next to each other. And Federer probably is done winning Grand Slam championships. So let's say he pauses at 20, and then it's really just between the other two. Djokovic being the interesting party in this group because he has an actual positive head-to-head against Federer and Nadal. He's beaten both of them more than they've beaten him. So that adds kind of another wrinkle to the argument. And maybe that's because he started playing and beating them more after his real breakout and ascendancy to the top of the rankings in 2011. And that's all good because we can use majors, but we can also use head-to-head. And you'll get nowhere because we can always find another way to determine that someone is better, right? But then there's even more nuance in the tennis debate because of how the game is played. And what I mean by that is the different surfaces. In basketball, of course, the surfaces are the same. In baseball, you might have grass or artificial surface. And in football, also grass and artificial. But in tennis, there are at least 3 different surfaces. And in the 70s and 80s, those surfaces were drastically different. So much so that one person really couldn't win them all. And between 1968 and 1999, and 68 is where the Open era began. So between the beginning of the Open era, where everyone was allowed, amateurs and professionals were allowed to play, in between 68 and 99, only Andre Agassi won a major on each of the 3 different surfaces. And this wasn't in one year. This was a career that he was able to win a major on each of the three different surfaces, which are hard court, grass court, and clay court. And that was because that was hard. It took an adaptable person with the talent and the work ethic to do that. You had to figure out how to win on those surfaces. You had to beat other people who were good, and it wasn't easy to do. So why isn't Agassi considered the GOAT? If he could do this feat when it was close to impossible. He was the only one to have done it over a 30-year span. That's got to mean something, right? And it's been said that around the beginning of the 2000s, the surfaces were started to be made more homogeneous. And it's been thought that because the tournament directors wanted longer rallies, because they liked the longer rallies, it was more exciting than short points. And in Wimbledon, where you had really short points, they wanted their grass to hold up longer, so they changed the composition of the grass too. And the effect was that the surfaces actually all began to be closer to the same surface. So the balls kind of bounced the same. The ball was the same speed coming off the surface. So instead of them being drastically different, where grass and clay back-to-back tournaments, majors, were really hard to make the adjustment, it was actually not so hard. And the US Open actually was a little bit closer to the clay surface. So someone like Nadal now, who loves the slow points, who's the way that he hits the ball and the spin he puts on the ball is super effective on clay, it's pretty effective on the US Open surface too. So that stark difference that used to be between the courts, it's not really that different now. And it's helped benefit the players. So this to me has helped a lot in terms of accumulation of majors anyway. So if we just want to use major numbers, we can't really just do that because the game played today is so much different than the game that was played 30 years ago. And because of this, Djokovic and Nadal have achieved those career Grand Slams, and so has Federer, of course. So those three guys have all had the career Grand Slam where it was only just Agassi before them in 1999. So you got to think that either these guys are all the greatest or there's something tricky going on here that we don't know about. Because how could these three men accomplish this one feat that only one man could do in the 20 years before them? And so with that in mind, are we going to discount the older players because they competed on distinct surfaces and they played in an era where the courts were harder to adjust to and harder to win on? And of course, they played against tough competition as well, so you can't discount their competition. Players in the 70s and 80s tallied major championship numbers 7, 8, 9, 10, but they're legends in the sport, such as John McEnroe, who won 7, Jimmy Connors and Bjorn Borg, and Borg won 11, and he was thought to be one of the best of his time because of how well he was able to play the French and Wimbledon, and he was able to win those back-to-back on 3 separate occasions. Or even Roy Emerson, the Australian player, who was the first man to reach 12 majors, and he held that record for the most majors from 1969 until 2000, 31 years where he had the most majors, because winning majors was really hard at that time. So are we now just going to use the major count when there's a lot more going on than just winning majors? And of course, before there used to be specialists because of the differences in the courts that showed up and competed well on certain surfaces. And we can say Nadal basically now is a super specialist in that he's so dominant on clay, but he's also able to branch out. But it would be like Nadal, except Nadal would only be good at clay. Now, that made it even harder to win, and that's something that, of course, you can't just take into account with just a number of majors. And okay, if we're not going to do majors, how about we look at overall tournament wins? Now, winning a lot of tournaments would require a long peak and maybe some luck to stay healthy. And what do we look at here? Competition, singles, doubles, mixed doubles. There's a lot of different types of tennis matches that are played in different types of tennis tournaments. Well, if we look at that, John McEnroe, who I mentioned before, won 156 tournaments over his 28-year career, which is to me interesting. It's great. It's cool because he won 77 singles and 78 doubles, and then 1 mixed doubles. So he's just as balanced in terms of singles and doubles. And the Bryan brothers, who are double specialists, they are second with 128 and 126 tournament wins, but they don't have any singles wins, so they're great too, but only in that field of doubles, which doesn't discount them, but it shows that they're not as versatile as John McEnroe was. Let's look at the most singles victories, just the most singles wins, and that's Jimmy Connors with 109. over an equally long career almost as John McEnroe. And Roger Federer, one of our current GOATs, as we say, has 103. So tournaments won, Federer's not even the top in terms of number of tournaments won, but he is the top in terms of the number of majors won. And that also goes to show a lot of these guys actually are just gunning for the majors now because they want that number to be high to cement themselves as the best ever, the GOAT. But they're manipulating it because they know if they win majors, that counts. They're not really looking to win every tournament. They can sit out some and skip some that aren't mandatory because they can be healthy for the majors, which is where the money is and which is where the glory is. So that's not something that we saw 30, 40 years ago, but it is something that we see increasingly more now. So if we want to do tournaments, just overall tournaments, are we looking at McEnroe for his record that probably won't be beaten anytime soon in terms of total tournaments won? Are we looking at Connors, or are we still going to say Federer because of his majors tournaments won? There's another argument that we can use that's somewhat statistical based, but it's more of a ranking system. That's ELO rankings. And 538.com ran an article about tennis ELO rankings all time for the men's side, and they found that Djokovic actually had the highest peak ELO of all time. So, meaning he's beaten harder competition than anyone else in tennis history, right above Bjorn Borg, who's second, and then John McEnroe, who's third, then Nadal, then Federer. And Nadal and Federer at their peak were only separated by 2 points, which is basically even. So these rankings show at what point were these players playing at their highest level and what was that level. So the argument there could be said, okay, Djokovic is the best ever because when he came into his prime, he was playing against the two other GOATs, right? So that is why, and he's beaten them more often than not. So that's why, and it's a statistical thing. It's almost statistical. It's numerical because once you beat someone, you get a certain amount of points for beating them. So as long as you beat the right people, then that ranking is going to go up. And he's dominated during a time when other great players were playing too. And is that what is enough to make him the GOAT? I don't know. Again, these arguments aren't cut and dry, and we could argue all day about it, and we're not going to get anywhere if we're trying to settle on a definitive answer, right? Let's look at the women's side of tennis. Serena is called the GOAT, Serena Williams, and of course, I only need to refer to her by one name, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. She's called the GOAT because of her 23 majors. That is the most in the open era on the women's side, but she's never had a year as dominant as Steffi Graf's 1988 year, in which she won all 4 majors and the gold medal in the Olympics in what they called a golden slam. ELO also says that Graf had the highest peak of any women's tennis player in her career, though Monica Seles was threatening to beat her ELO ranking at the time, and she had beaten Seles in 3 of her 4 Grand Slam finals before she got stabbed by a fan in 1993. So even then, Graf could be considered the best, but Seles could also be considered to be the best because everybody knew Seles was coming. Seles was going to pass her. She was already number 1 at the time she got stabbed. Martina Navratilova has the all-time wins record for men or women in terms of tournament victories with 167 singles titles and 177 doubles titles. Just a dominant player. But who's saying that Martina's the GOAT? Why are we not? So there are many others to name, but to me it's clear Serena, while she might be the GOAT, she's definitely dominant. She's not the only contender for the title in women's tennis. To summarize, I think there's always a preference that people have that can't be quantified or even properly explained. It's just a feeling that people get when they see a player play. And it might go back to their childhood or whatever was the best time in their life and who they saw playing at that time, those memories. I think it's kind of ridiculous to have the argument about who's the GOAT and who's the best and expecting it to yield some concrete answer. Like I said, if I use that term GOAT too much, it sounds weird and it starts to be a funny sounding word in my head. So what I think is that we need to enjoy these athletes for what they do because they won't always be around to entertain us. And we need to understand that what they're doing is at such a high level that it doesn't matter who's the best ever. We'll never know who's the best ever. And I think it takes away from the joy, to me, of the competition to sum up who's the GOAT in any sport by trying to reduce it to one time period or one incarnation of that sport. The NBA we're playing in now, the NBA we see played now, is so different than the NBA that's ever been played before. So that is one incarnation of the sport that has its best players, but the sport will change, it will evolve, and there will be best players in that era. And I think all we need to do is understand, just appreciate it. I remember that they were doing the Jordan LeBron debate, and Kobe sent out a tweet, and he was like, it doesn't matter, just enjoy Jordan's 6, enjoy my 5, enjoy LeBron's 3. And I thought at the time he tweeted it that it was ridiculous. I thought he was just kind of injecting himself into the argument just because that's what something that Kobe would do. But looking back, I think he's 100% right. Just enjoy what these athletes bring to the table. And when we do that, I think it'll be more enjoyable. You can have your conversations about who's the best ever, but I think you should seek to enlighten, seek to learn from other people. And then I think you'll really be able to appreciate what these athletes are doing. And of course, if you're going to use stats, which I think you should do, have some perspective on what they mean and what story that these stats tell. So that's all I got. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.